Welcome to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
where we discuss all things Bible and theology.
Because it matters. What you really believe determines how you really behave.
Now, here is your host, Associate Professor of Bible Exposition at Dallas Theological Seminary
and Professor of Bible and Theology for the National Theological College and Graduate School,
Dr. Paul Weaver.
Welcome back to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast. Today's podcast is sponsored by the National Theological College and Graduate School, also known as NTCGS. NTCGS is a strategically placed school with 3 campuses in the Middle East and 1 in East Africa. I am looking forward to my conversation today with Dr. Mark Ward, who I follow on YouTube and have benefited from his witty videos, blogs, and articles. Last week, we wrapped up a 6-week series on the life and theological writings of C.S. Lewis, and today we're shifting gears a bit and beginning a new series on English Bible translations. This week, we're going to discuss the incredible impact that the King James Version has had in the English-speaking world, as well as how it has been misused and abused. And next week, we will discuss other English Bible translations and how to choose a good translation. And to have these conversations, I'm pleased to have a subject material expert in this area, Dr. Mark Ward. Dr. Ward is the editor of the Bible Study magazine for Faith Life, who are the makers of Logos Bible software. He's an avid YouTuber, both for Logos and his own personal YouTube channel, and he's the writer of a column entitled Word Nerd, Language and the Bible. He's also the author of several books. Most important for our discussion today is his book entitled Authorized, The Use and Misuse of the King James Bible. Well, Dr. Ward, I'm a Midwesterner, a transplant here to the South. I grew up in Columbus, Indiana, a city in the southern part of the state that had a population of about 35,000 people at the time. I attended a Bible church where my senior pastor was a Grace Theological Seminary graduate, and the associate pastor, who would later become the senior pastor, was a Dallas Theological Seminary graduate. I had no idea that there was even a debate or controversy surrounding the King James Version. In fact, it wasn't really until I spent 2 years in West Virginia in the late 90s in an area where there were many King James only churches as well as King James preferred churches that I became aware of the controversy. After knowing what to look for from my collegiate experience, I did become aware of a King James only church in my hometown of Columbus, Indiana, and then discovered one of my uncles was frequenting a King James only church in northern Indiana. I had 2 occasions to visit that church with my uncle, and that church proudly displayed on the front lawn sign, King James Version 1611. And I think both times that I attended this church with my uncle, the pastor referenced the importance of using a King James Bible. This subject has intrigued me and saddened me ever since. So I'm glad, Dr. Ward, that you were willing to come on the Bible and Theology Matters podcast and help us to better understand the controversy and how to respond with grace and truth to those who are King James only. Would you explain what King James Onlyism is and then distinguish it from those who are King James preferred?
Sure. I do think it's important as a matter of charity to listen well enough to your brothers and sisters who take a different viewpoint than you do on some doctrinal issue to really map out their positions in ways that they could nod to. I tell friends and foes alike, I don't promise to use labels that everybody accepts because that's part of debate. And this is a debate. So I do use the term King James only, but I find a lot of people in the mainstream of what used to be called King James Onlyism kind of don't like that phrase anymore. But the mainstream King James only position, and I still think that's an appropriate word for it, trusts only the King James Version. It's the only English translation that is really viable for them. But there are more extreme views, and that will help me help others understand the mainstream view. The more extreme view would be called Ruckmanism, and that's a view in which the King James is itself inspired and perfect, and in a sense corrects the Greek and Hebrew, that is, all the variants that have come down in the Hebrew and Greek manuscript traditions for the Old and New Testaments. They have to be solved somehow, and the King James does this. It also solves ambiguities in the Greek, where we're not quite sure how to translate, well, whatever the King James translators did, that's right. That's the extreme view. The mainstream view, again, It's just that the King James is the only truly trustworthy Bible translation in English. And it tends to add also that whatever textual critical decisions the King James translators made, those are the right ones. So it often will say in that group, the text is actually the issue, not so much the translation. They'll say that the Textus Receptus, which is indeed the Greek New Testament edition that the King James is based on, that's the perfectly preserved Word of God. They look to passages like Matthew 5:18, where Jesus says, not a jot or a tittle will pass from the law until all is fulfilled. And Psalm 12:6-7, the words of the Lord are pure words, purified 7 times. Thou shalt keep them, O Lord, thou shalt preserve them from this generation forever. They look at passages like that and say there must be a perfectly preserved Word of God. God wouldn't inspire His Word and fail to preserve it. So it must be the texts that were in use for the longest time in our recent cultural memory, which may not have been the ones that were actually in use for most of the church. That's more difficult to demonstrate, but those must be the ones underlying the King James, because clearly God has blessed it. I would, in general, say that's the King James only viewpoint. King James preferred, I wonder how often this is really an accurate descriptor of people, because there are people who look at the doctrinal problems created by the various King James Onlyisms and say, well, no, I just prefer it. But what I often find when I kind of press on that preference is that the doctrines of King James Onlyism start coming out anyway. So I'm not saying such a position is dishonest. I do know people who simply prefer the King James. They love its older English. It's what they grew up with, as I did. And I'm very grateful for the King James Version. I certainly don't want to throw it in the dumpster. But the preference, I think, often ends up also putting down other contemporary translations. And as we'll talk about, I'm sure, I think ends up giving short shrift to other Bible teaching about what a translation should be.
And so when a sign prominently displays 1611 on the sign, what does that indicate?
That's probably a Ruckmanite church, a church involved in extreme King James Onlyism. Ironically enough, in all my experience, those churches don't realize they're actually using the 1769 edition of the King James. And actually, there are multiple other editions. And there are some in more recent years and last century or so that have 8 or 10 differences, between the Oxford and Cambridge editions. And the people who are really, really into it will pick the pure Cambridge edition, for example, to be the perfect King James version. But that tends to be associated with the views of Dr. Peter Ruckman and his extreme understanding.
And how common is that Ruckman variety of King James Onlyism?
I get this question often, and it's really hard for me to say, how could you fairly answer that question without some kind of Barna survey or something? I'm not aware that that's ever been done. I think I'd be one of the first to be aware if that were done. I actually like to be involved in some Barna surveys. I actually tried to do it and discovered how much it cost, and then I backed off. So if any of your listeners are wealthy financiers who want to help me, the study I want to do is, are people in King James only churches actually understanding the King James, as well as all of their pastors insist that they are. They all tell me everybody understands it just fine. There's no problem. But I think this is just my gut feeling after years and years being involved here, that there are thousands of King James only churches. And if I can include the more extreme and the less extreme, I feel safe in giving the number thousands. And if there's 100, 200 people in each church, and certainly very large churches and actually numerous large institutions, Pensacola Christian College is King James only, Ambassador Baptist College, Crown College, West Coast Baptist College, Golden State Baptist College. A lot of them are Baptist, of course, Independent Fundamental Baptist. If I can use institutions and churches as a guide, I'm going to have to say we're in the hundreds of thousands of Christians who hold this viewpoint with varying degrees of certainty. And usually the degree is 100% of certainty, because that's the whole appeal of the position. It gets you out of having to make a judgment call on textual variants, out of making a judgment call on which translation is best. This one is the best one and everything else is untrustworthy and actually probably part of some kind of conspiracy to undermine the truth. And the King James Onlyism has spread actually around the world. I've been told by reliable sources that there are 5 translations of the King James Version, not of the Greek and Hebrew, but from the King James into Korean. And there are Korean Baptist churches who fight over which of those translations is the perfect translation. It's unutterably sad to me that we've exported this problem around the world. But it's understandable that we have it, because the King James is an awesome translation, and it's epical, and it's monumental in our language and our culture, and certainly in our churches. I'm grateful for it. But the Bible doesn't teach that we should use only one translation or expect a perfect one. So I, of course, cannot support the doctrines of King James Onlyism.
Would Hyles Anderson be in that vein as well, or?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I could go on and on. That's one of the larger institutions as well. They were part of the more extreme brand. I'm going to say they're still kind of on the border between the extreme brand and the, mainstream brand of King James Onlyism. I think they would say they're not Ruckmanites, and I think they'd be sincere. I try to treat people as sincere when they state their positions, but then when you actually look at the way they treat the King James version, there's a fair bit of Ruckmanism coming out there, where the only way the King James could be that perfect is if God inspired it.
I have one story that I'd like to share of an interaction I had with a KJV only person, but actually it was my brother's interaction, to be clear. This occurred almost 16 years ago, and I was a missionary with Word of Life in the country of Hungary, and I was back in the States to get married and raise additional support. And my brother, who's a pilot in Los Angeles at the time, wanted me to fly out and see LA, visit him. And I was just a financially struggling missionary, newly married. I didn't have the money to spend on 2 tickets to Los Angeles. But I said to my brother, if you can get me into 2 or 3 churches to speak, I'll do it, because those churches usually provide an honorarium and that could help offset my travel expenses. So he said, okay, what kind of churches normally support you? And I said, Bible churches, Baptist churches, and sometimes community churches. And so what did he do? He pulled out his phone book, back when we had phone books, and turned to the yellow pages, right? And he began calling Baptist churches. So he begins cold turkey calling, which of course, is not very effective. He got a pastor on the line and said, my name's Keith Weaver. I have a brother who's a missionary in the country of Hungary, and I think you should have him to your church to share about his ministry in Hungary. The pastor paused and then said, well, what translation does he use? My brother proceeded to say, having no understanding what he was asking, I believe he uses the Hungarian translation. And the pastor then said,
great.
Well, what version are you used to translate it into Hungarian? And my brother, still naive and oblivious, said, well, I think they use the Greek and Hebrew. And the pastor then says, well, when he's in the United States, what translation does he use when he preaches? And my brother, once again, still unaware of what this pastor's asking, said, well, I believe he uses whatever translation is preferred by the church he speaks in. And that pastor then said, well, I don't think your brother would be comfortable here. We believe in purity of doctrine. My brother recounted that story, and I had to explain to him what was going on there, but he stopped calling churches and trying to get me into some churches in the LA area. So would that be a common experience?
That would be absolutely common. I was an assistant pastor in Anacortes, Washington, basically for 6 years. And I would get phone calls from people sometimes who are coming on vacation up in that beautiful area. And that would be their only question. What Bible translation do you use? And I think this is a good example of how King James Onlyism is, in some sense, that ultimately only God can judge, a work of the flesh. And I mean that very sincerely and directly, because Galatians 5 says that division, contention, and strife are works of the flesh. And everywhere I look, the King James is a dividing line. It's a convenient line because it's clear. I can trust these people because they use the King James, and I cannot trust these people because they don't. And quite obviously, that isn't a sufficient point of judgment, or whether we can trust other Christians or not. And we shouldn't be dividing over something that the Bible doesn't teach. But everywhere King James Onlyism is, the King James is the symbol, the banner, the totem that separates that group from other Christians.
Dr. Ward, for our listeners who may not be familiar with your story, would you explain why this topic is so important to you and why you have chosen to really become a specialist on this issue?
It's important to me because I love God's word and I want to understand it. And I always, my entire life as a Bible teacher, going back into my teen years when I didn't even know that's what I was going to become, I've always looked into people's eyes that I was teaching, or at that time more likely evangelizing. And as I quoted verses, I'm looking for understanding. And I sensed very early on, people are not understanding this language. They're not missing all of it. They're getting some words. Maybe they're getting a lot of it, but they're not getting all of it. And that was bothering me even before I myself was using other translations. I grew up in a good Christian home. My parents were saved as adults, and I am so grateful that they made the major sacrifice to put me through Christian school. When we moved back from Word of Life Ministries, actually, where my dad was the publications director, I think that was his title, for 5 or so years, 5.5, 1987 to 1992 or 3. We ended up, my dad was working for National Religious Broadcasters, and that's in the DC area, and we lived in Northern Virginia. That's where my family is originally from anyway. And we wound up at a King James only church in large part so we could attend their Christian school. And I always say, and this is absolutely true, I had a wonderful experience. I loved my teachers. They loved me. I really feel that I thrived there. I saw how these otherwise faithful, wonderful Christian people were shut off from the rest of the Christian world. And more importantly, were not understanding the Bible as well as they thought they were. And that's what motivates me. The division that this creates, this is something that is used everywhere to cause division. That bothers me. Jesus called for unity in John 17. I'm willing to come out of apostate organizations, but there are many conservative evangelical institutions that are far from apostate that King James Onlyism will have nothing to do with because they don't use the King James. That isn't right. We're dividing the body of Christ. And then probably again, what's more important to me is that people understand their Bible. And I was involved in evangelism in the not so nice neighborhoods of Greenville, South Carolina for many, many years. And I taught Bible verses. We actually used the New American Standard Bible at my church starting when I was about 19 or 20. And even that was so difficult for these kids. And I would have them repeat, keep sound wisdom and discretion so they will be life to your soul and adornment to your neck. Then you will walk in your way securely and your foot will not stumble. And I would ask them, what does this mean? What does this phrase mean? What does that mean? And they just didn't know. And I just began to think, what's the point? Why do we teach people Bible verses that they don't understand? You teach kids in Christian homes Bible verses in Awana that you know they're not going to grasp fully until they're older. That's okay. I understand there are times that you do that, but especially in evangelism, when you don't know if you're ever going to see this person again, why in the world would you teach them words that even in 10 years they're not going to understand? That's where my motivation comes in being involved in this debate. And then one real quick thought. I just saw that as Don Carson and James White very carefully and effectively talked about textual criticism and showed how the King James only position just doesn't match with the teaching of the Bible or the facts of history, I saw that that was not accessible to most people in the King James only world. They're not dummies. They have many God-given gifts, but New Testament textual criticism is not one of them because very few of them can read any Greek. So I realized, wow, I don't even really care to talk about that issue with folks for various reasons we could get into. Let's just talk about English. They should see 1 Corinthians 14 teaches that edification requires intelligibility. And here are all these dead words we know we don't know. And I began to see false friends, we'll talk about this, words we don't know. That's where the real problem lies. And that's where I focused my work in this debate.
Well, very good. And as you allude to a couple other books, and I have them on my shelf behind me, and one by D.A. Carson, as you mentioned, by White as well. D.A. Carson's book, The King James Version Debate, A Plea for Realism, which you've got to love the subtitle. A little bit offensive there to a King James only person, maybe.
Right.
And then James White's book, The King James Only Controversy. But as you indicate, yours has really a different tone and approach I really appreciate. And I was expecting when you gave me these complimentary copies, by the way, thank you for those. As I was reviewing them, I was expecting something in the vein of Carson and White. But yours I thought was very helpful in a different way. But clearly they were preaching to the choir, if we could put it that way. In other words, it was written for those who are not KJV only or KJV preferred or whatever term is being used, but people that want to become equipped to respond to King James only people. Even the subtitle I mentioned, A Plea for Realism, I think would be a little offensive possibly. And
right.
In the same way that John MacArthur's book, Charismatic Chaos, is very
right.
helpful and useful, but certainly isn't appealing or even persuasive to a charismatic person because it
right.
maybe can easily offend someone from that vantage point. So I really appreciate the tone and tenor of your book. It seems apparent that you are not trying to win the battle, but rather win the war. Right? It seems evident that you're writing with the KJV only person in mind. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. And I actually don't know that I was as successful as I prayed and hoped. What the Lord actually did through my work is different than what I expected. I thought I was talking to King James only lay people. And surely there are a few that I've heard from, have read the book and watched basically the same material on my YouTube channel, just vastly elaborated. Hopefully same tone and surely same argument. But what I'm finding is that I don't really reach the lay people very well. I think I'm reaching the pastors. That's what the Lord is doing. So I've been hearing from King James only pastors basically constantly ever since my YouTube channel came out, and a little more slowly since after the book came out. Before that, I've heard from literally hundreds, and I have a meeting with one of them tomorrow to talk about what does he do now? He's a supported missionary, and he's not any longer King James only. How does he handle this with integrity? So I don't think it's very easy to talk to the lay people in that world, because when the King James is the symbol of your doctrinal fidelity as opposed to the corruption of everybody else. Why in the world would you want to read a book that you know is going to undermine this doctrine? I think I'm public enemy number 2 right now behind James White in King James Onlyism. I'm okay with a ministry that really seems to mainly be reaching the pastors.
Well, that's interesting. I think of C.S. Lewis. He was a skeptic turned believer and became called the apostle to the skeptics. Clearly, having been coming from that vantage point, you know how they think more so than White and D.A. Carson, although I'm very thankful again for their books on the subject.
Yes,
so
me too.
Appreciate what you're doing, and I think you can be the apostle to the King
apostle
James
to the King James Onlyists. Yeah, that's a weird calling to have. I feel a little embarrassed sometimes to say that that's what it is, but I love these folks, and I think the Lord has placed a love in my heart for King James Onlyists, and they respond to it. And I think that is as big a difference as understanding them. So Carson and White wrote great books, and they're really helpful, but they weren't really part of that group. White actually very briefly was, but I was part of that group. I love individual people in that world. There's just no way I can blow them all off.
Right.
And that, I'd like to hope, at least, that love colors all my ministry to them. There are arguments I'm not going to use, not just because they're off-putting, but because I don't want to offend people that I truly love. And there are times, too, when I could score some easy rhetorical points. I mean, there are many times when I could do this, and I pull back because I think that is playing to my crowd rather than to theirs. And that's not what love does.
Dr. Ward, I was really shocked by what I read in your introduction now. Now I'm quoting you. Out of every 100 Americans who pull a Bible off a shelf, 55 of them pulled down a King James version. Then you go on to write, I feel fairly safe in saying that the King James is the only 1611 release still on any bestseller lists. Before we get to some of the reasons to use modern translations, let's do what you did in your book and extol some of the virtues of the King James Version and how impactful it's been in the English-speaking world. We don't want to be anti-King James, just as we don't want to be anti-Geneva Bible or anti-Coverdale Bible or anti-Wycliffe's translation. Would you elaborate?
Right. And I love the way you put that because I am constantly being told by all varieties of King James defenders, because there's a Calvinistic variety of King James defense too, called confessional bibliology. And one of their proponents, who's online all the time saying stuff like this, was saying to me, well, you just hate the King James Version. You're against it. And I always say to them, that's just not true, brother. I'm not anti-Wycliffe, but if there were a Wycliffe-only movement, I'd be complaining about that. I would give the same complaints. And I often ask them, brother, if people were insisting on using the Wycliffe Bible and only the Gothic type or Tyndale even, we can't change the spelling because that's the very best and most accurate. You know, whatever their arguments are, what would you say to them? Do you have any arguments against Wycliffe onlyism or even Geneva or Tyndale onlyism? And I've never gotten an answer to that particular question. I hope I do over time. The King James Version was, as I said earlier, epical, monumental. It's had a massive impact on our language. There are tons of phrases. The scholar David Crystal actually wrote a book on this where he traced out, I want to say it was like 240 something different phrases that made it from the King James into our modern speech, you know, by the skin of his teeth and let there be light and on and on and on. That's a great cultural value. It's also valuable for churches to use the same translation. I don't deny that. I grew up in a world in which all the churches I knew, you know, I was young, I didn't know all churches, but all the churches I knew in the 80s and 90s were using the King James. And there were just phrases that I sort of picked up out of the ether, you know, learned by osmosis, not because they were Awana memory verses, but because they got preached on, they got mentioned, they were alluded to over time. There's a lot of value there. I do think that the King James is at a good place on the spectrum of formal to functional, what I would call a useful place. And out of honor to it, I just tend, you know, when I get to choose translation, as I did yesterday, preaching at a church about 40 minutes away, I preached from the ESV, not because I think it is the best Bible translation that's taken over the spot of the King James, but because it's at a very similar spot on the formal to functional spectrum. I find functional translations, dynamic ones, you know, NIV and NLT to be useful as well, and I certainly would use them in appropriate situations, but I think the King James hit a good balance between a willingness to be literal and stick with the Greek and Hebrew forms and word order and an ability to be literary and understandable. So we have a wonderful heritage in the King James James Version, and I am truly grateful for it. I am not opposed to the King James Version. And in fact, whenever I read the King James preface, a little feeling arises in my heart of, man, I cannot let the King James Onlyists claim the mantle of the King James when actually I'm the one who holds the views of the King James translators. If they were alive today, what would they be doing? I think that they would be producing translations made into the language of today's quote unquote very vulgar. That's what they called them back then.
Right.
They wouldn't call them that today. It would be the plowboy or the common person. I think the best way to honor the King James is to continue the kind of work that the King James translators did, making the Bible available to the people.
Dr. Ward, what are a few of the most common King James only arguments, and how would you respond to those?
I think it's really helpful and important to distinguish arguments about text from arguments about translation, and maybe I'll just give one of each. When it comes to text, quite obviously, anybody who's looked into this even a little bit, or even just looked at the footnotes in their English Bibles, including the King James, will see things like in the King James, it'll say some copies read, or in the New King James, it'll say NU text reads, or in the ESV, certain Greek or Hebrew manuscripts read, and then you'll get an alternate reading from what's actually in the text. And that's upsetting to a lot of people. Evangelical Christians, such as I myself, we believe in the inerrancy of the Bible, the inspiration of the Bible, and it's maybe not totally fun to have to acknowledge, okay, well, the copies that came down to us, the handwritten copies of the Hebrew Bible and Greek New Testament, actually contain these variants, these differences. I've run into Christians plenty of times who just had no idea that this was the case. I can understand why that's unsettling. And in the realm of text, what the King James Onlyists will do is they'll anoint one text and say, this is the final one. This is the pure one. We can only use this one. Everything else is absolutely corrupt. One of the Calvinistic variety called the New American Standard, he said it's based on Satan's Bible. And what he means is, it's using the corrupt Greek and Hebrew texts, the ones that aren't perfect, like the preserved texts that underlie the King James Version. That is their big argument about text. I already gave the proof text that they use, the main ones, Matthew 5:18, Psalm 12, 6 and 7. Briefly, how I'd respond to that, and then we'll get on to translation. I don't think Matthew 5:18 or Psalm 12, 6 and 7 are talking about perfect textual preservation at all. And even if they were, the Bible just does not tell us where or how to find this perfect text. The fact is, everywhere we look, we're looking at texts that are the product of humans doing their best to copy or to revise printed editions of the Greek New Testament. Everywhere you look, even in quote unquote the Textus Receptus, you see variants. Actually, there are numerous editions of the Textus Receptus. Most King James Onlyists in the mainstream don't even know this. And in my experience, they don't know. There are Texti Recepti, plural. Well, if the Textus Receptus is the pure and perfect text of the Greek New Testament, which Textus Receptus is the one? The Lord simply hasn't given us the special revelation necessary in His Word to tell us which is the pure text. And so therefore, I certainly don't think we should be dividing over it. And actually, I think that means these passages can't be talking about perfect textual preservation. And then when it comes to translation, they will simply say that the King James is the most accurate and faithful translation of the Bible. Again, there's just no time to go into all of it. But one of the most common arguments I always hear, actually late last night as I was uploading a YouTube video to the channel, the last of the Textual Confidence Collective podcast episodes, I was also finishing up a text debate that I was doing with somebody in the Calvinistic King James Defender world. And we were talking about the accuracy of the second person pronouns of the King James. So the Elizabethan English, especially back into the 1500s, used thee and thou and thine and thy as singular second person pronoun forms. And they used ye and you as plural second person pronoun forms. And so that's convenient because that matches the way Greek and Hebrew work as well, where second person pronouns are distinguished in number, as we say. But contemporary English does not do this. The King James Onlyists will say that's a marker of the supreme accuracy of the King James Version. We've absolutely got to hold on to it because this is an essential part of its accuracy. And a very brief response to that is that in any translation, from any language to any other, you're going to lose some minor grammatical details that will be taken care of either by context or by footnotes. So in English, no, we can't distinguish whether, hey, are you going to go to the store refers to a single person or multiple people. But that's okay because I'm looking at a person. only one person. And in that context, it's obvious you is singular. The same thing happens in the text of Scripture, where most of the time you can figure out whether it's singular or plural. And again, a footnote can take care of it if you don't. But then what King James Only has never mentioned is that there are plenty of other grammatical elements in Greek and Hebrew that just can't really be translated easily into English. There's grammatical gender. Are we going to mark the masculine words with blue and the feminine words with pink and the neuter words with gray? No. How about relative pronouns? Whom? 2 Timothy 3:14, Paul says to Timothy, continue thou, I'm going to quote the King James myself because this is what I grew up on, continue thou in the things which thou hast learned, knowing of whom thou hast learned them. Whom is either singular or plural, and actually there's a textual variant there, but it's untranslatable. In Elizabethan English, it's untranslatable, and in contemporary English, it's untranslatable. And the world still spins. It's okay. We can get along without knowing whether that's singular or plural. That's the way God made language. There's a theme out there among conservative Christians, and I totally get it, that we want every bit of information that God has inspired. And I want it too, but I have to adjust my expectations to fit the world God gave me, where the only way you're going to get every one of those little grammatical details is if you learn Hebrew and Greek.
How would you encourage a believer that maybe this is the very first time they've heard their textual differences in the Greek and Hebrew manuscripts?
I would jump right into Dirk Jonken's book for Crossway, An Introduction to the Tyndale House Greek New Testament. If you're in college at that level, that's where I go first. If you're not, or if you don't have time to do that right this second and you're disturbed, 2 resources super quick. One is one I made and one is Dan Wallace made. The one I made has been endorsed by Dan Wallace for what it's worth. It's the KJV Parallel Bible. It's kjvparallelbible.org. And if you go to that website, you can see for yourself in English all of the differences between the Textus Receptus. This would actually be Scribner's Textus Receptus. It's basically the set of textual critical decisions made by the King James translators, and the critical text, in this case, the Nestle-Aland 28, that basically underlies, most modern translations. You can see them in English. And I think what you'll see in those parallel columns that jumps out at you is not the differences, but the similarities, verse after verse after verse, that are exactly the same. And even when there are differences, they are so incredibly minor most of the time. They don't make any difference to the overall meaning. So the second resource that I would point people to would be the Net Bible that actually Dan Wallace was, heavily involved in. And I love the Net Bible notes. I actually don't use study Bibles hardly ever. I'm going right to commentaries, but the Net Bible is really the one that I'll pull out because I find the translator notes and the textual critical notes to be so helpful. It's just going to show you at point after point in English, in understandable prose, why a given text may appear different in the King James New Testament versus the contemporary translations of the Bible. My problem with the King James, with its current use, it's not with the King James, it's with its current use and exclusive use, is not really the textual critical issues, because I think they're incredibly minor. I really do. My problem with King James Onlyism is the English intelligibility. That's where I want to focus the discussion.
Well, and Dr. Wallace, you can find on YouTube a 2-part series that he did at Biola University on textual criticism. I think it's a real good, quick overview, and it really gives you confidence that what we do have is, in essence, the very word of God, because we have 5,800 manuscripts. I think that's the most recent number of the Greek New Testament. And so we have an embarrassment of riches, as Dr. Wallace talks about, in the Greek manuscripts.
Could I break in 1 second and say I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Textual Confidence Collective that I'm a part of that actually recorded. It was going to record at Dan Wallace's house, didn't work out, so we did it elsewhere in Dallas. But we put out a 7-episode series talking about these very issues and trying to give a good introduction to lay people.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Ward, in your book, Authorized, The Use and Misuse of the King James Bible, you have a chapter called Dead Words and False Friends. Would you please explain what a dead word is, and if you would, provide a couple of examples?
Yeah, a dead word is a word that we know we don't know because language has changed and that word has dropped out of the language. I think most people who've had any exposure to Shakespeare or the King James Bible or Chaucer will know what a dead word is. You look at this and you just know you don't know what it means. So bewray, B-E-W-R-A-Y, or bold, B-O-L-L-E-D. It's not an alternate spelling of bold as in confident. It's just a totally different word. Or emerald. That could be a different spelling of a contemporary word, an uncomfortable one, hemorrhoid, but then you encounter it and its spelling is so different, you know you don't know it. That's a King James word in Samuel. There are numerous, there are dozens, if not hundreds of these dead words, and King James Onlyists will actually make helpful lists online and even in print, and they'll even put them in the margins of King James Bibles that they themselves create. I've got D.A. Waite's Defined King James Bible on my shelf, and this is what he does. And I've always found it remarkable that they themselves know these words are dead, but they don't see any problem with this. Like, do we have to say besom? Can't we just say broom? That's a dead word.
And then in your YouTube videos and writings, you discuss false friends a lot. And what are false friends? And please give some examples of those.
Sure. A false friend is a word we don't know. And this is really my, I think, single most important contribution to the debate. And I gave this label to it so it could be easily packageable and shareable. And I definitely see that terminology out there online in the discussion of this topic now. And I always smile, a little smile, and thank the Lord that I got to play this role, because this is coming from me. False friends, words we don't know. Let me give my classic story. I'll do it quick. I was reading 1 Kings 18 as I was preparing a Bible lesson for 8th graders. I used to be a Bible textbook author for BJU Press, and I was checking multiple translations as we commonly did. And, I was all too eager to do that myself. I've been using multiple translations in my Bible study for going on 2 decades now. And I had heard this passage preached, numerous times. It was one of those verses that I had learned by osmosis just by being in the Christian community. And in it, Elijah says to the Israelites who are gathered to watch this contest that's going to occur between him and the prophets of Baal, he says to the Israelites, "How long halt ye between 2 opinions? If the Lord be God, then follow him, but if Baal, then follow him." And I was reading in the ESV, and it said, instead of "how long halt ye," it said, "How long will you go limping between 2 opinions?" And I thought, that's not right. Limp and halt are not the same. And the King James translators were not dummies, and the ESV translators are not dummies. I better go check the Hebrew. I checked the Hebrew. The Hebrew said limp, not halt. To me, halt means stop. How long will you stop and stand stock still between these 2 options? Make a choice. Don't be lukewarm, in other words. Don't vacillate. And I thought, boy, the King James translators aren't dummies. I just can't believe that they made an error here. And there's no textual variant in the Hebrew. That's, less common in the Hebrew than it is in the Greek New Testament. That's not likely to be the reason that we see a difference here. So I searched for the word halt in the King James. Back in my BibleWorks days, I searched BibleWorks, and I saw in the New Testament that Jesus heals the halt and the blind. And suddenly it hit me. Duh. In 1611, in a context like that one, 1 Kings 18, "How long halt ye" meant "how long limp ye?" How long will you go limping? The King James translators and the ESV translators were saying exactly the same thing, but they were speaking to 2 different audiences. The King James translators were speaking to an audience that is now dead, that spoke an English that we do not speak anymore. And I often compare it to a Venn diagram. The circles are no longer fully overlapping. And, they overlap a lot. We can understand a lot of the King James just fine. But at the places where they don't overlap, where certain elements of King James language have gotten left behind, or certain changes in our English have moved on, you're going to cause misunderstandings. And once I saw that, and then later got a label for it, false friends, I started to see it all over the place. And now I have a series on YouTube called 50 False Friends in the King James Version. I'm actually up to 57, or no, I think 59 now. I have 2 more that are coming out in a video that actually a YouTube viewer found for me. And they were so good. I was like, you've got to come on my channel for an interview and let's talk through these things and let me show people I'm not the only one who can find these. The King James only folks always tell me we just have to teach people to read all the words in the King James Version. They can do it. And my rural congregation has no trouble. My people in my prison ministry have no trouble with the King James. My small children have no trouble with the King James. And I say, brother, I really doubt that, because I was that kid. In fact, I was the spelling bee champion. Sorry to have to boast here a little bit, but and the National Geography Bee state finalist in the state of New York in 1993. And I was a nerdy kid. And I prided myself in the, sinful sense of pride that I could read the King James Version. But it wasn't until I could read Greek and Hebrew and started checking other translations that I started to realize how often I was missing these false friends in the King James Version. I'll just stick with that one example because I could go on, and you can go to my YouTube channel if you want to hear more examples.
That's right. That's very helpful. So would you say that speaking about dead words and false friends is the best response to a King James preferred person?
100%. Because again, I don't care if someone uses the TR as long as they're not causing division over it, saying my text is corrupt. What I care about is that they understand the Bible. And actually, what is the best way forward in debate? Isn't it to find some kind of common ground and try to work from there? So I find that people's defenses go right up if you want to talk text, and then you can't get anywhere because how many people can truly talk intelligently about New Testament textual criticism? It is a very complex field. And if you really want to talk intelligently, if you don't want to answer a matter before you hear it and have it be a folly and shame to you, you have to know Greek. I feel like I'm insulting people every time I say this, but I don't know any other way around it. You cannot have an intelligent opinion, an intelligent discussion about this if you don't know Greek. There are people in that world who do, and with whom I can have an intelligent discussion, and I do it. But that is a tiny, tiny minority. Dear listener, you're not likely to run into somebody like that. And you yourself, dear listener, may not have sufficient knowledge of Greek to really have an intelligent conversation. Why would you argue about that? Because then what you're actually arguing about is which of our respected authorities, respective, I should say, are trustworthy. The ones I trust, Don Carson and James White and Dan Wallace, or the ones you trust, D.A. Waite and Sam Gipp and Peter Ruppin or whatever. No, that's a totally different discussion. Let's not talk about that. Let's talk about what the Bible actually addresses. The Bible nowhere tells us how to adjudicate among differences between biblical manuscripts, but it does tell us edification requires intelligibility. And all these dead words and false friends mean that you can't just tell people, okay, well, don't be lazy. Go look up these words in dictionaries. Anybody can look these words up in dictionaries. I hear this all the time. And I always respond, brother, how are you supposed to look up words you don't even realize you're misunderstanding? Words you don't know, you don't know. That's what false friends are. And debaters, public debaters are fond of saying, I never had anybody respond to that. But now I sort of have. I've had people say, well, you just need to look up every word. And I say, then what's the point of translation, brother?
Yeah.
Why bother? Why not just send people back to the Hebrew and Greek? Translations are there to help us understand. And if they're no longer helping us understand because English has moved on, then the translations need to move on. As C.S. Lewis said, and I love C.S. Lewis, he said, you can't translate the Bible once and for all any more than you can get your son a suit once and for all. He's going to grow. Languages are a changing thing. A commitment to translation is a commitment to retranslation or revision. That's what Lewis said.
Well, Dr. Ward, as we wrap up our discussion, realizing that most of our listeners do not use the King James Version as their primary translation, but maybe have family, friends who are King James only or King James preferred, what would be your advice to them as they interact with their friends and neighbors who do have these perspectives?
I think you do want to watch as many of my videos as you can, and I'm not saying that in a self-serving way. I'm saying it because I care, and I wouldn't do this. This is not highly remunerative work, just so people know. I put in 2 years on my YouTube channel and a lot of other hours on other tasks related to this before I started asking for Patreon support. And the reason I asked for Patreon support was that I incurred a pretty large cost just to get down to Dallas to do these Textual Confidence Collective videos. And I thought, okay, I've got my Bible telling me I'm not required to do this for free. For 2 years, it was my privilege, like Paul, to do this for free. And now I have support from people who not just give to me, which is so appreciated, but they also pray for me, and they regularly tell me encouraging things and tell me especially that they are praying for me. I've done this work because I care. So I give it to you. I put it on YouTube freely for you to enjoy. I would say watch as many of those videos as you can. And then that will help you distinguish text from translation. And my advice is rigorously distinguish between the two and refuse to talk about text. You make the same feint, F-E-I-N-T, with your epee sword, okay? Every time someone says to you, but isn't the New American Standard based on corrupt Greek and Hebrew texts that are impure and undermine the deity of Christ? You and I may know that that's totally ridiculous and not true. It's, in fact, slanderous and a total confusion, but don't even talk about it. Just say, you know what? That's okay. If you prefer the Textus Receptus, then make or use a Bible translation into contemporary English that's fully intelligible and therefore obeys 1 Corinthians 14. I keep repeating that and repeating that and repeating that because I see people get mired in the mud or the briar patch of what is in essence a conspiracy theory that, the New American Standard and ESV and NIV translators say they're trying to give the word of God to people, but actually they're trying to undermine the truth of Christianity by removing the deity of Christ and lessening the number of times the word Lord appears. It's a conspiracy theory. How do you reach somebody who's stuck inside the perfect circle of a conspiracy theory where they can explain everything? You make the circle bigger. You try to show that that circle can't actually include all the truths of the world. And I think the most important way to do that is English. Second second real quick point is just point people to the work of trustworthy, truly evangelical, Bible teaching people such as Vern Poythress. He's one of my favorite ones to recommend because I run his website and I honor and admire him very greatly. He is godly and memorizes more scripture than you can shake a stick at. And he was an ESV translator. I think we need to build bridges of trust into the King James only community by showing them the kind of solid Bible teaching that comes from the very people who give us the modern translations. That's my advice.
Well, excellent advice. Well, our time is up for today's program, but I do hope that you'll join Dr. Ward and me again next week as we continue our conversation about Bible translations. In next week's podcast, we will discuss the differences between English translations and the theories behind those translations, and then provide you with advice on how to choose a good translation. You won't want to miss it. And if you'd like to get a copy of Dr. Ward's book, Authorized, The Use and Misuse of the King James Bible, you can purchase it on Amazon.com or at lexhampress.com, or you can add it to your Logos digital library at logos.com. And if you'd like to help us take the Bible and Theology podcast to the next level, would you consider becoming a patron of the Bible and Theology Matters podcast by donating as little as $5 a month to help us with expenses and allow us to keep producing quality programming? We would greatly appreciate it. You can do so with a credit card or PayPal at patreon.com/Bible and Theology Matters. That's patreon.com/Bible and A&D Theology Matters. Until next time, never forget, Bible and Theology Matters, because what you believe determines how you behave.
Bible and Theology Matters podcast is a listener-supported podcast
devoted to helping Christians grow in their knowledge of the Word of God and in their relationship to the God of the Word.
To learn how you can partner with the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
Visit us at BibleandTheologyMatters.com. That's Bible, A-N-D, TheologyMatters.com.